Hey, I'm Faye. Welcome to my top tips on crocheting waistcoat stitch to get that knit look but in crochet. I have lots of good tips for you. You may also know this stitch as the centre single crochet in US terminology, centre double crochet in UK terminology, knit stitch or crocheted knit stitch. It's all the same thing, so I'm just going to refer to it as the waistcoat stitch. And in this quick guide, I'm going to take you through how to make that stitch in both rounds and rows, how to increase and decrease in both rounds and rows, which hook is best, because that makes such a huge difference to how easy it is to make waistcoat stitches, and also some ways to approach colour work crochet in both rounds and rows of waistcoat stitch. Let's dig in. I find that the best way to make waistcoat stitch easy to crochet, is to use the right hook, and I think there are three contributing factors. First of all, because you're working the stitch through the front of the fabric rather than at the top, it's going through a smaller space, and so a hook with a very decent point on it will make that job of poking through the hole much easier. The one on the left is bamboo and it has a really good point on it, and the one on the right is metal and it's just a little too rounded. I tried most of my crochet hooks and definitely my bamboo ones with the point were so much easier to do waistcoat stitch with. The second contributing factor is the bowl that you have that scoops the yarn back through to the front of your fabric. Now, as I've said, the hole that you are working through from the front of your fabric to the back is quite a lot smaller than it is with a standard stitch where you're going through the front loop and the back loop at the top of the stitch. So having a bowl on your crochet hook that is really quite deep, that easily scoops that yarn through a small and difficult space, is very helpful. And then there's one final thing that I think is also a contributing factor, and that is using an inline hook rather than a tapered hook. The metal hook on my right is tapered ever so slightly, some might be more pronounced, but it is tapered, whilst the bamboo hook is an inline hook, so it has a larger circumference throughout the hook, but particularly at the bowl. And what that means is with every stitch you are forcing a wider tension out of your stitches, out of your yarn around hooks, out of your golden loops, and it's that forced extra tension that keeps a wider space, a bigger stitch, and will ultimately make waistcoat stitch easier to crochet. If your stitches are small and tight, it's much more difficult. So these three top tips of a pointy hook, a deep bowl, and an inline hook are all really helpful when it comes to working waistcoat stitch and crochet. So let's go through how to make a waistcoat stitch in the round. It's essentially the same as a double crochet in UK terminology, single in US. The only thing that really differs is where you place your hook. Instead of putting it under the front and back loops at the top of the stitch as you normally would, it actually goes into the V at the front of the work. So if you're right-handed, that V will be slightly to the left of where your front and back loops are, and if you're left-handed, it will be to the right of where your front and back loops are. So place your hook through the V at the front of your work and try to make sure that the hook is coming out the other side through the upside down V, which is the back of the stitch. That will help to try and keep your rounds vertical rather than slanting to the left or the right if you're working in a spiral. Then it's a yarn around hook, and carefully pull that yarn from the back to the front of your work with your hook. You'll have two loops on your hook, yarn around hook, and pull through both, and that is how you make a waistcoat stitch, and that creates that V on the front, which you'll then come to work through when you do your next round. And every time you work into that V, you're creating the stacked stitches which give you that knit look for waistcoat stitch in the round. A top tip for you is that if your hook feels like it went in too easily, it's probably gone under the front and back loop, so remove your hook and go again. When you work into the V at the front of the stitch, it's a much smaller space, so you're going to get some friction and it will be more difficult to pass your hook through. But again, make sure your hook is going in through the V at the front, through the upside down V at the back, yarn around hook, pull up a loop, 2 loops on your hook, yarn around hook, pull through both. That is how you make a waistcoat stitch. But try and keep your tension loose, because that looser tension will make every round easier, every stitch easier, because you're creating a bigger space in the V to work through. Let's now take a look at working waistcoat stitch in rows. It's a little different from working it in rounds, and you get a different looking fabric. So instead of the stacked V's and that very knit look that you get with waistcoat stitch in the round, within rows you get a diagonal slant of your V's down through your fabric, and the V's are sat almost in like a diamond brickwork fashion. Let's show you how to do that. So the hook placement is slightly different in that it's going through an upside down V, and you place your hook through that upside down V, and then you want to make sure that when it comes back out the other side, on the back side of your fabric, that it's going through a V shape. So from the front it's an upside down V, and your hook is poking back through into a V on the rear. And if you keep on doing that, then you will get the same looking fabric on both sides. And then it's a case of yarn around hook and pull up a loop, scooping that yarn back through to the front, 2 loops on your hook, yarn around hook and pull through both. So it's basically the same as a double crochet in UK terminology, single crochet in US terminology, but the hook placement is on the front of your work, not underneath the front and back loops on the top of the stitch that you would normally have. So that hook is always going to go into the upside down V on whichever side you are working on. Increases in waistcoat stitch in the round are really easy. You're basically making 2 waistcoat stitches into the same one stitch. So making sure that you are going through the V at the front for this first stitch and coming out in the upside down V on the reverse side, and then repeating that again into the same stitch. So hook through that V, coming back out through the upside down V on the other side, yarn around hook, pull up a loop, 2 loops on your hook, yarn around hook, pull through 2. And that gives you 2 stitches within that 1 stitch of the round below, and that's your increase. Now sometimes it can be a little difficult to find out where your increased stitches are, and a good trick for that is to look for the front and back loops of the stitch at the top. Use that as your guide to find where your hook will be worked into for the stitches where the increase was made. They can be tricksy, so just look for the front loop and back loop on the top of the stitch as your guide. Waistcoat stitch increases in rows are really easy to do. It's basically doing 2 waistcoat stitches into the same 1 stitch, and both times you make sure that your hook is going through the upside down V at the front and through the V on the reverse side of your fabric. And then it's just a case of waistcoat stitch, hook through, yarn around hook, pull up a loop, 2 loops on your hook, yarn around hook, pull through 2 loops. And once you've done that twice, you will have increased by 1 stitch. When you've turned and you're on the next row, if you can't identify where your stitch is, look for the front loop and the back loop at the top of the stitch as your guide, and then trace your stitch down from there. It can be a little more difficult to find in an increased stitch, so look to the front and back loops above to find your stitch below. Decreasing waistcoat stitch in the round is really simple. It's a lot like doing it in a double crochet or a single crochet US, a DC2 tog. Basically you push your hook through the V at the front, coming out in the upside down V at the back, yarn around hook, pull up a loop, you'll have 2 loops on your hook, and then place your hook through the next stitch, through that V, coming out through the upside down V at the back, yarn around hook and pull up a loop, bringing your hook from the back to the front. You'll be left with 3 loops on your hook, and then finally yarn around hook, pull through all 3 loops, and you have decreased by 1 stitch. Now you'll notice that the first stitch that was part of the decrease overlaps the second part of the decreased stitch. When you come to work the next round, I would place my hook through that first one which is overlapping, and that will create a slightly elongated V, but it looks quite neat. That's how you do a decrease in waistcoat stitch in rounds. Decreasing waistcoat stitch in rows is pretty simple. You start by placing your hook through the first stitch, so through the upside down V's at the front and out through the V at the back, and then it's a yarn around hook to pull up a loop. You'll have 2 loops on your hook. Then you place your hook through the next stitch, through the upside down V at the front and the V at the back, yarn around hook, pull up a loop, and you'll have 3 loops on your hook. Then it's a yarn around hook and pull through all 3 loops to finish off. That leaves you with a decrease of 1 stitch, and you'll see that the 2 stitches kind of sit one on top of the other, with the first part of the decrease stitch sitting over the top of the second part of the decrease stitch. I'm just going to quickly put in another couple of waistcoat stitches so that I can turn the work and show you what that decrease looks like on the other side after I've turned. Now I'll put in 2 more waistcoat stitches, taking us up to that decrease stitch. Over to the left is the decrease stitch, so again, if I want to work that 1 stitch, I'm looking to go through the upside down stitch on the front, and remember that I've got that overlap on what will now be the reverse side, the back of my work. So I want to go in through the upside down, and I want to come in through the first part of that decrease stitch, which gives me a slightly elongated V on the other side, which looks okay. It's a little obvious, but it's still reasonably neat. And that's how you do a decreased waistcoat stitch in rows. Waistcoat stitch colourwork is popular because it sort of mimics the look of knitted colourwork. As with all colourwork, the most important element is how to make the colour changes. The new colour is always introduced in the final step of the stitch before the new colour is needed. This means that the final stitch of what will be the old colour is completed with the new colour. When you get to the final yarn around hook, the new colour is placed over the hook. I do this without a slip knot, and then it is pulled through both loops on the hook. You can see that the old mink colour has created the front and back loops of that last stitch, and that the new yellow colour is ready for the next stitch where the colour change is required. I like to give the tail of the old colour a little tug just to help even up the tension, because it can get a little loose. If the 2 colours are required throughout the round, then you will also be trapping down or carrying the non-working yarn. For me, that's the mink colour. This means that it will sit at the back of the round and it won't be seen on the right side of your work. In this example, I want to make some yellow stitches before I go back to the mink colour, and I want to carry the non-working mink yarn behind the working yellow stitches. So when I get to the second yellow stitch, I'm going to trap down the mink yarn, which is my non-working yarn, so that I don't have a long stretch of yarn at the back, which is what we call a float. So to trap down yarns, put the hook through the stitch, you place the non-working yarn over the top of the hook. So that's my mink yarn that goes over the top. Yarn around hook with the working yarn, which is my yellow yarn, and you pull up a loop, scooping the working yarn from the back to the front, making sure that it goes underneath that mink non-working yarn. That's really important. Let's finish off that stitch and add another. When I turn the work to the wrong side, you can see that the non-working yarn is now trapped further along the round and is closer to the point where it will be needed again. This technique helps with colourwork tension and stops you from having long floats of yarn that would get snagged and pulled in things like colourwork mittens or bags. I'll quickly show you the technique again. Put the hook through the stitch, place the non-working yarn over the top of your hook, that's my mink colour. Yarn around hook with the working yarn, that's my yellow colour. And I pull up that loop, scooping the yarn from the back to the front, underneath the non-working yarn so that it's trapped again further along the round. Now I'm ready to make another colour change back to the mink yarn. This is always done on the final yarn around hook on the stitch before the colour change is needed. My work now has 5 yellow stitches and my mink yarn is neatly secured at the back, ready to be used again at the right place. Now, depending on what you are making and the weight of yarn you are using, you may want to choose a different frequency for trapping down the yarns. For example, in a 4-ply mitten design I have just been working on, I trapped down the non-working yarn every 3 stitches because that created shorter floats that were unlikely to get snagged by rings and little fingers. If I was working with a chunky yarn, I might be tempted to trap down the non-working yarn every 2 stitches because the larger stitches will mean longer floats at the back. No matter what the yarn weight is, I wouldn't go more than 4 stitches without trapping down the non-working yarn. This just helps to keep even tension across your fabric. You can also do waistcoat stitch colour work in rows, but it won't look the same as it does in rounds. The nature of waistcoat stitch in rows means that there is more colour bleed from one coloured stitch to the next. It can still look very striking, but you can't build up recognisable motifs in the same way as you can in the round because the stitches are disjointed. So for clean colour work motifs, waistcoat stitch colour work in the round is what you really want, and if you want more of a soft colour blend, then waistcoat stitch colour work in rows is perfect for you. Hopefully you found all of that information really helpful. They're most of my top tips, but I have got more in a blog post for waistcoat stitch crochet that I'll link below. Hopefully you're off trying out different things and different motifs to get that kind of knit look V-stitch that you can get with waistcoat stitch like these in my Breton baskets. Lots of things are possible. I'd love to hear what you're making with it. Thank you.